Welcome to Armenia.
Thanks so much.
How was it after 25 years?
I mean, it's very different. Seems like a very different media scene than the last time I was here. I think people have gotten pretty sophisticated in what they're doing. And just the city itself is like a lot more colorful, nice to be in. Although at the same time, it feels like there's a lot of tension right now about the political situation, about the security situation, that I don't think it felt like was hanging over everybody's head so much at that time.
Going to your career, what initially drew you to journalism and reporting from that conflict zones?
I mean, I always wanted to be a journalist from high school, and I had an underground newspaper when I was in high school, kind of exposing the scandals of our school administration. And then when I went to college, I played in a lot of bands, and I studied literature and history. I didn't really study journalism. But when I started to think about what I really wanted to do, and I wanted to do journalism, and I was really into audio, it just felt like a natural match. I thought I was going to be doing newspaperman stuff, but instead I'm doing, I think pretty high-end audio stuff. And it's a lot of fun. It's not a lot of fun being in conflict zones, but it is super interesting. And, I did a lot of production stuff from studios for a long time. And then at a certain point, I just decided I wanted to get back into the field. And at the time, the U.S. was, a couple years into the war in Iraq. And so that's kind of just where I started to go to, and Afghanistan and other places. So I don't spend all my time. There are a lot of people in journalism who spend way more time than I do, but I have, sort of taken my share of it, I guess.
Do you think that you're doing something very important for people?
I think we all try to do what we can and hope that having better information helps people make better decisions. But sometimes it can feel like you're kind of sending your, efforts off into the void, and you don't really know if it's having any impact at all. So you kind of have to just hope that it is, and kind of get whatever feedback you can.
So how in this world nowadays a person should want to be a journalist? It's very complicated right now.
There's so many people kind of undermining public trust in journalism.
Yeah, also there's war, and it's very, dangerous maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been the ability, for people who are open to or interested in covering conflict, there have always been wars. I'm not sure it's much different now than it has been. I think the kind of people who want to go into journalism are people who are super curious about the world, and sometimes a little nosy. I think I've always been a little bit extra curious and sort of happy to kind of dig into people's business and see if, especially, governmental stuff, to see if there's issues, accountability to be had. I like discovering things that other people don't know, and I like to tell people about them. And I like people. I really enjoy meeting new people, and kind of, I think, sometimes breaking down my own preconceptions about how people might be. And you go to a place and, I find that people, even in the worst of circumstances, are way cooler and friendlier and more helpful than you would imagine if you're back home. Now, all that said, I think there's tons of journalism you could do that you don't ever have to be in any danger at all, and very valuable journalism. It's just a little slice of it.
You talked about fact-checking, and are you sure that all the facts are checked when you're talking about some kind of stories?
You do the very best you can. We always try to have at least two sources. If we have somebody tell us something, we try to find at least one other, and hopefully more than that, people who can corroborate it, or documents that, back up what's been said. And we also have a very rigorous editorial process. So I may go out and get information, do interviews, have people saying certain things. And if I miss something backing it up, we have an editor who's going through all this stuff, and we quite often have conversations about how do we know this, and could you make a couple more calls, and could you call that person back and make sure you had that right. And then even after it gets through that point, we have a fact checker who goes through our scripts And, on things that are just, it could be a date, it could be where a person's from or how old they are, what they do for a living, they'll just double check that stuff and make sure that we're not missing something. So there's a lot of, sort of working back and forth with colleagues. That said, do we get things wrong sometimes? Of course. And I think the other piece of it is that when we do get something wrong, we make every effort to correct it in a public way, to make sure that we're not just trying to slide by.
How do you make connection between you and your audience through your podcasts?
Well, podcasts are sort of different than radio in a way. I think when we talk about doing radio and how you should speak on the radio, we always talk about just trying to have a one-to-one connection with the person on the other side of the radio, right? Because it's not like you're talking to a whole room full of people. You're really just talking to one person at a time. And I think that's very powerful. And I think when people do that, it works really well. But most of the time, if you're doing a story for a news magazine about some event that happened, it's important to make it about the event, about the person you're talking to, and not make it about your experience of it and, whatever your deal is, right? It's not about you, it's about them. I think podcasting has a little space for something different and has a need often for something different because you're sticking with this host person for a long time. And often over the course of episodes, the hosts are the only constant people. So you're always looking for change. You're looking for somewhere you're starting the story. And then in the course of it, somebody's going to change. Something's going to change in order for it to be a meaningful experience for the listener. They are signing up to take a journey with you to some extent. And I think you have to put yourself in it a little bit, at least. And in that way, I think it breaks down some barriers. I think it calls out sometimes a little bit of a fiction about objective journalism, that we don't have a point of view or that we don't, have a life, that relates to the things that are going on. For example, in the podcast that we just did, there's this podcast, Taking Cover, that's about a friendly fire accident that happened early in the Iraq War. And talking with some of the guys, it was very important to establish a rapport, as you said, and some of that was sharing my own experiences and some of my own, trauma, my own PTSD. Even talking to them about their stories could be kind of, triggering or whatever you want to say. And so I did talk with them about that. And then as we were going through and putting together the podcast, it just felt right to include some of that in the podcast because I think it lets the listener realize the kind of conversation that you're having as you're moving through the podcast, and also so that they can understand how to take on board the interactions you're having with this guest instead of thinking that you're somehow a disinterested, robot or something.
You were in a war in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, in Afghanistan.
Sure.
You lost a friend in there.
That was not when David Gilkey was killed. He was killed a couple years after that. I was not on that particular trip. It was my co-host of the show, Tom Bowman, was with him on that patrol with another producer from NPR. So, yeah, all that said, it was horrible. Yeah, it was really painful.
Did you find yourself feeling fearful for your own safety after that? And were there moments when you thought of leaving behind your journalistic career after that?
I haven't really. For whatever reason, and I don't know if it's just that I'm wired differently or whatever, I don't really feel scared downrange. Like if it's a bomb's gone off and there's a firefight or, things are chaotic. It's just the adrenaline hits and I want to get the story and I just I want to get out there and start recording stuff. And honestly, just the kind of work keeps me on task in a way that the thoughts don't really enter. They should. You have to be conscious of the risk, and try to make smart decisions when you're in the field. But I have never really experienced that. And I haven't really kind of freaked out afterwards on that kind of stuff. What gets to me more is kind of living with a state of heightened awareness and sort of tension for a long period of time, and sometimes, experiencing traumatic things or talking to people about their experience of trauma. And then when you kind of step out finally from the, start going back home, then it kind of can come in a little bit, and it can be a little hard to relate to other people who don't really understand what you're dealing with.
Did you tell your own stories to your characters to make like a more safe space?
Sometimes. Yeah, and not, I think, to manipulate them or something like that, but really just to lay my cards on the table, to say this is where I'm coming from. So if I'm asking these questions, at least you can know that I've had these experiences, and you can deal with me however you want. But I think it's fair to them to let them know what's up. But it does, I think, for certain things, allow people to have conversations with me, that they might not be able to have or be willing to have with somebody who hadn't shared similar experiences.
Now you have a Pulitzer Prize. And how do you measure your success of your podcast projects? And what criteria do you use to evaluate their impact and effectiveness?
Well, yeah, it hasn't felt like it's handicapped me in any way. You would think in a way it's like, oh, everything else has to be, has to also win a Pulitzer or something like that. And it's just not. It's, sometimes the luck of the draw. You can do really good work, and other people are doing terrific work as well in other organizations or in our organization. And, not everything's going to win all the awards in the world. And you can't judge yourself on that. It's nice to have affirmation from your colleagues in, the world of journalism. You just got to keep plugging away, doing the very best work you can. I think it does kind of open doors a little bit in a way, because I think people might take you a little more seriously if they look you up before they talk to you and they're like, okay, this person's for real. As for effectiveness, it can be tough. Sometimes I think with investigative journalism, or what sometimes people call accountability reporting, where you do the story and like somebody gets fired, or you do a story and a law gets changed, and that's incredibly gratifying. But sometimes all you're doing is putting information into the world. You're able to discover information, so you bring them some answers. Whether or not there will be real change out of it, sometimes it's just out of your hands. So, you do your best to answer the questions that made you curious in the first place, and hope that the world's going to pick up on it.
What advice would you give to aspiring journalists who are very much like to pursuing investigative journalism?
I do think going after documents early is really important. It takes forever to get them usually, because you got to deal with government people, or you got to find things. That's one thing, sort of put that in motion. And the other thing is just, be honest with people who you're dealing with about what you're going after and why you're going after it. You don't have to come out with everything to somebody who may have been doing things bad, but I think people want to help, and there are a lot of people in investigative work who have ended up on the wrong side of something, right? Who have been negatively affected by decisions that other people made. And they want to help you sort out what's going on, because sometimes you have tools or you have access that they don't have. So you can answer questions and open doors that they've never been able to. And I think asking for that kind of help and being straight with people about what you're going after is really helpful, because they want to help.
Thank you so much. Hope your next trip will be less than 25 years.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.